cultural references. You know, as you're growing up, you watch a lot of movies, and America has a lot of soft power on the world through their culture. And you know, you rarely see, except for Edward Scissorhands perhaps, depictions in boring suburbia. There's often this idea that anyone can walk down to their main street and get the local conveniences, but also live in a highly walkable and compact environment. This is the sort of the depiction of life that we like to have in our heads, but not necessarily the actual reality of what we're building. Here in Australia, you know, these aren't books from a bygone era. Obviously, I just explained that I'm in a new part of my life where I'm reading children's books, and I was just so delighted to see some of these Australian authors who with amazing Australian illustrators, with some of the, you know, these urban references that they're getting. And we're lucky enough to live in Victoria Park in Perth and walk down to the cafe strip. So my daughter and son will hopefully get that experience and lifestyle, but not everyone does. This is by and large where the majority of new people are being housed, in something that's approximating this kind of environment. And I'm not sure how that would go in being depicted in a children's book. Photoshop's artificial intelligence thinks it's something like that. So how did we get here? Well, I'm going to unpack some of the standards and policies that apply to any new community. And they're not necessarily, I've chosen not to focus on planning regulations, because I guess there's a little bit of a misunderstanding, I think, that if we can get the zoning right and all the planning controls right, and then we can get the type of developments that we want. And there's so much more complicated and overlapping regulations and policies in other areas that you really need to unpack to understand spatially what that all means. And some people have seen this presentation before. Hang tight, because there is a new updated urban section on the back of Millie's request. So this is a typical suburban environment. It could be anywhere in inner city Sydney or Melbourne, that middle ring, 5 to 10 kilometres from the city. This particular example is in Mount Lawley, but it could be any cherished inner city suburb in Perth. And obviously what happens is the first move that we make is we say that the garbage truck has to make a lane correct manoeuvre on a very low order access street. These two streets in particular are dealing with less than 1,000 vehicles per day. It's really not necessary that we design around the garbage truck for such low order streets. It makes sense on a highway because you want to avoid a head-on collision. But when a garbage truck can simply come once a week and make a manoeuvre by moving onto the other side of the road, it means that we can keep those curb lines nice and tight. But of course we don't. So what do? We design for the garbage truck without giving it too much thought, which represents on this particular road about 0.1% of all traffic movements. What that means is all of a sudden the majority of cars that are taking that corner can now speed around it. But of course it's created a cascading impact. It's created some sightline issues. So of course, what do? We put in some truncations quite often. At least in Perth, they're 3x3. I know in other jurisdictions where you're seeing oversized sort of 6x6 truncations, and certainly you would on major roads. So that interrupts with the private lot and the look and feel of the street, and also encourages that idea of openness and speed. The next thing we do is we don't design for on-street parking, despite our planning guidance saying that we should. Obviously, smaller lots and the regular interval of driveway crossovers is a problem. But there is also a cultural issue there in your suburbs. But you've got to get the design right with a appropriate sized carriageway, and then also, perhaps some line marking just to hint that it is possible to park on that street, because that will create the slower yielding effect that will have the dual purpose of slowing down the vehicles and making it safer for people walking. So we remove the parking. And then the next mistake we make is, in our older cherished suburbs, you always see that the footpath in wider road reserves is back of the property line, not back of the curb line. So we push the footpath adjacent to the street pavement, which is precisely where people are uncomfortable walking, because of course these are 50km/h roads, and everyone I'm sure would have seen this graph that's showing the exponential increase in serious injury or death, when you get to 40 and 50km/h. So that's what the data says, but from a perception point of view, you really don't want to be next to speeding vehicles, and it doesn't help when you're pushing a pram in particular, as I've just found out. So you need to keep that separation from people walking and the moving cars, and it also allows for street trees to act as a buffer. So that's how it should be designed. That's how it is in our livable neighbourhoods documents. But this is typically how we deliver it. Now, the motivation from local governments, of course, is that no one will apparently maintain these sort of patches of verges if we break up where the footpath is, and obviously that doesn't hold true in every single suburb that it is delivered in cherished inner city suburbs. So you can slowly see how we're sort of eating away and getting towards something that we don't want through the standards that we're applying. So we do have smaller lots that we're dealing with in outer suburbs, so it's unlikely that we're going to get trees retained in private land, but do focus on the public realm at least. Some dodgy airbrushing going on there. And just for good measure, we've got our colour-bond fence fronting the side boundary, just to put the nail in the coffin. The other problem that happens is there's 3%, generally 2 to 3% grade is the maximum that you can achieve on verges under the Utility Services Code in WA. So what that means is if you've got any kind of topography, well, it needs to be flattened, which means the prospect of retaining any trees is quite minimal. And also note that many trees have buffer, or councils have buffer requirements around trees. So you've got a buffer to the nearest light, you've got a buffer to the nearest driveway, you've got a buffer to the nearest drain. Quite often when you overlay those buffers, you'll find that there's no room for street trees. And that's how we get these suburbs that we have. It's not because of greedy developers or anything, although we can talk about that. But the point is, with this particular presentation I'm trying to make, is that developers are simply just building what the government standards are. And I put this together, and we put in the smaller lots for good measure. Suburban Nations book came to mind. Obviously, our heroes there, Duane, Plater Zyberg and Jeff Speck, who say that somewhere along the way, through a series of well-intentioned steps, traditional towns became a crime in America, and I add, also in Australia too. So there is a way, obviously, to do this under the current standards we have. It's just a change of a framing of mind. So the first thing, as I said, this is very clear in element 2 R57 of livable neighbourhoods. It says that the garbage truck can cross the centre line of the road on low order streets. That means importantly, we can keep that curb radii tight, and that's the first design move. What that means is you've got You've got cars approaching at a perpendicular angle. They're no longer taking it at speed on the angle, and that means that their sight lines are actually improved. And we don't need that big truncation. Maybe we can have a small one or do away with it altogether, depending on the width of the road. We can allow for and encourage street parking, and we can keep those footpaths where they are. And that means that they're on the desire line. You see, again, if you are in a wheelchair or pushing a pram, the only people who actually use a footpath that's back of curb correctly where the pram ramps are, because you've designed it off the desire line when crossing the street, are those more sort of vulnerable users. Everyone else will just walk across in a straight line. So you design for how people are going to use it. So of course, we keep the footpath straight. And then of course, we probably need to accept that that the amount of trees that we get on private land is going to be difficult, although here in Western Australia, medium density codes and some further work is attempting to address that. And then go and find local governments that have the smaller buffer requirements. I'm not sure what the experience is over east, but over here, generally all local governments have different buffer requirements, and some are much larger than the others. There's some standardisation happening there, but you can see we could deliver this suburb in theory under the current standards that we have if the right people are in place. But putting the onus on the developer to negotiate those things, on those individual standards every single time, when their motivation is obviously to get in and out as an investment game, you can understand why they're going to take the path of least resistance, and we keep getting the suburbs that we get. So this is the exact same local government area, but I'm sort of asking the question, was it a different engineer? Like, this is literally up the road, same sort of local access street hierarchy. There's the correct way we should be delivering a street, and there's the incorrect way. Now you can see what I was talking about with the footpaths off the desire line, and the way we've designed for speed, because we've designed for that garbage truck, and everything gets flared out. It might sound like a pretty minor thing, but it makes a huge impact to the way that people experience their neighbourhood on a daily basis, particularly when they're trying to walk and navigate, and particularly for elderly and young people. In regards to those buffers, this is another way to look at it. So this is not too far from where I am in town of Victoria Park, and I've taken their standards, which is basically 1.5 metres from street trees, which is on the smaller end of local government standards. And what you'll find out if you overlay those on a historical street, you'll find that those street trees shouldn't be there according to those policies. So that's what your compliant street's going to look like, unless you can find a way to deliver street trees that aren't conflicting with those buffers. And just as a closer look, that's what I'm talking about. So anywhere that we're close to a crossover, we're close to a drain, we're close to a street light. Now these are obviously conflict areas. Well-intentioned things that we do in isolation, but the sum of the parts is not making great places. Now, let's switch over to more urban precincts, and just want to start with thinking about some historical precedents and the spatial definition that they provide. So not even talking about the architecture yet, but just the fact that this is George Street in East Fremantle, and it's a 15-metre road reserve. Now, that would be so difficult to get approved with today's traffic studies if you were trying to get a road reserve that skinny in a town centre environment where there were, more than 6,000, whatever it is, cars a day. But what that means is it's created a really tight, compact urban environment that means that it's so easy just to dart across without any formalised crossing points. and it means that it supports retail on both sides of the street. When streets get too wide and they get bloated, not only does the traffic move quicker and it creates a barrier, but it just all of a sudden becomes so difficult for people to walk across the street, let alone see what's on the other side of the street. You lose that spatial definition. So enclosure is super important. And Jan Gale talks about the principle of 30 metres when he's designing public open spaces. 30 metres is where 100 metres you can start to recognise people that are known to you. At 30 metres you can recognise their facial expressions. So this helps us guide. When we talk about human scale, these are the kind of absolute sort of maximums that we should be thinking about. This was just literally last night down here at the Albany Highway Cafe Strip. Now, these are multinational firms, but they're behaving in a manner that responds to the built environment. This is a 20-metre road reserve. So we're building up now on Albany Highway. I had to take a picture of this because it's rare that you'll see a pedestrian crossing in Perth. They're so hard to approve, and it's changing a little bit, but it used to be that there was a back of the envelope formula by Main Roads WA, where the busiest 2 hours of any given day, the amount of people crossing and the vehicles intersecting with that particular point needed to equal 90,000. That was the formula that they would use. And if it achieved that threshold, then you could warrant a pedestrian crossing. And you can imagine why we haven't got pedestrian crossings popping up anywhere in Perth, because none of them would reach that particular criteria. And of course, that's got to be on roads that are lower than 60 kilometres per hour. So that's been a real issue that they're sort of chipping away at changing now. But as I said, if you design right, if you design slow, if you design with the right spatial definition, you don't need formalised crossings, because that's the whole point. And you'll see that on very good streets over east, like Crown Street in Surry Hills, like your Chapel Street in Windsor. And I love this shot. They've got everything so tight, but still we're still allowing for, we're just showing that garbage trucks can and larger trucks can come around the corner, and so much that can happen within a 20-metre road reserve. Trams, bikes, cars, wide footpaths. Yes, we don't have street trees, but these are historical precedents. Now, if we turn our attention to what's happening on the ground in new activity corridors, or centres, if you like, and they're very hard economically to make stack up with the sort of lower densities that we have in outer suburbs. Now, I'd say this is a fairly good example and an attempt in Secret Harbour. It's a 25-metre road reserve, so this is getting to sort of the minimum. 25 is in livable neighbourhoods, is sort of the integrator B town centre, I think they call it. So we're probably getting a little bit wider than probably you'd like to support retail on two sides and that informal interaction between the land uses on both sides. But I would say it's probably about at the absolute max, thinking about that Jan Gale principle and making sure that there's plenty of friction and not enough and plenty of things to slow down the vehicles naturally. Now, we do start to see some of these side streets blow right out in terms of allowing for lane correct garbage truck manoeuvres. Now, if I were designing this, I'd probably get rid of that central median to allow the garbage truck to cross the centre line of the road. So then I could tighten up this street, these curb lines here, so there's vehicles were manoeuvring a lot slower. But that's a pretty good example. This is showing you that it's not just all about spatial width and qualities. This is obviously making Millie's blood boil with the architecture there, but that's for another discussion. But this is very typical of the places that we are delivering in our outer suburbs. And when you think about those children's books and what what their idea of a local centre is when they're walking down with their parents and going to the nearby school. These are the experiences that they're having. Another fairly good example in Harvest Lakes. This is 22.5 metre road reserve. The architecture is nothing fancy, but it doesn't necessarily matter in a Main Street environment as long as you've got those fundamentals correct. But just note, this is very typical in outer suburbs where traffic studies are in service of a high quality level of service for vehicles and for safety. You'll often get this dumbbell effect of very large intersections at either end, which when you're navigating to the street, although it's quite pleasant for a short run when you're in here, it's getting to and from that on foot or on cycle is a little bit of an ordeal. And I love even that the Google Street View, that you can see the exposure and the camera's just like, oh my God, this is so bright. And that's what happens when you go to 33 metres. So again, you can see we're getting out of proportion here. We've got 25,000 vehicles moving down this street, but I'm going to show you why that's not necessarily the problem. It's about how this place is designed, and the land use is now responding to the transport infrastructure. So everything's turning its back on the street, and no surprises. Why wouldn't you? There's about 60 metres between these two buildings. It's far too much. This intersection is in service of the vehicles, and this is not a place where we should be encouraging a local centre to occur necessarily, because you just will not get pedestrian activity, or you will not get people sipping coffees next to an intersection like that. James Howard Kunstler, his presentation rings to mind. I think there's a TED talk you can find on YouTube where he says, relevant to America, obviously, I think he says, if you can see the curvature of the earth between the chunky chicken and the KFC, then that's nature's way of telling you that you've probably got enclosure horribly wrong. But the point here about the vehicles per day, this is Beaufort Street, a historical example that carries almost around the same, around 20,000 vehicles per day. There's only 26 metres between those two corners, and it's a 20 metre road reserve. So it still carries the same amount of vehicles, but we accept that we're not going to go out and destroy all these historical buildings and put in slip lanes. So we just accept that people will have a lower level of service there. Now, that's what we need to do when we're thinking about roads behaving when they're crossing through a certain built environment. So we don't just fall into the trap of this functional road classification. Okay, that's the one classification. It's got to change and respond to its context. And you do have to accept lower levels of service where it's important to have a higher level of service for the people walking and cycling. Sounds like we're a minor interruption. It's all good. Okay, so I suppose this is the main event. This is now applying it to historical Fremantle, and hopefully this gets the juices flowing in terms of spatially understanding the opportunity cost of some of these policies. So first thing that I would point out is we've got a 4.5 metre curb radii, and we've got one-way streets. That's probably unlikely to occur on any given street that you are trying to deliver in a new community. But let's just roll with that. So the first step that we do is we get our garbage truck select path out, and we'd go, oh my God, that curb's not going to support the garbage truck getting around the corner, despite the precedent showing that it is possible in Fremantle. They do behave. And hey, can't we talk about getting smaller garbage trucks anyway? We've got the government on our case about medium and higher densities, maybe there needs to be the next conversation about what infrastructure needs to respond to support that, that kind of stuff. Hey, Ellie. You gonna get nice and folded? Good one, yeah. I'll see you soon. So we have a 12-metre curb radio to make that happen. And as you can see, that's going to conflict with these beautiful colonnades and balconies and whatnot, and going to create all kinds of issues. So we've got a bit of a conflict there. And then, of course, you know, we haven't, heaven forbid, we haven't got our sight lines addressed in the truncations that we normally deliver. So those buildings have potentially got to be set back a bit further. We've got issues with private balconies in public land. There's there's examples around where it's been done in the modern times, and I'm pleased to see Subiaco has just approved one that's coming out of the ground in Rockaby Road as we speak. But traditionally there's been concerns of, you know, that blurring of the lines between public and private property, the liability concerns, and then of course in the 60s and 70s, you even had road agencies going in and actively taking out these intrusions into the road reserves. So notwithstanding, certainly on the corners, we're going to have to pull that back because it conflicts with those larger curb turning circles and the sightline requirements. So we'll take them out, and there's our conflicts removed, and we've still got this pesky problem of the buildings being within the truncation areas. So we'll just conduct a little circumcision of some of those buildings, and you can start to see how we sort of, if we were designing this place new, these are some of the considerations that we'd be thinking about. And 15 metres, as I said, in a modern context would be hard to do for a main street, particularly if it was dealing with a bit of traffic. Now, a critic might look at this and say, well, High Street doesn't carry a lot of traffic, and that's true, but I'm using this as an example to show that typically when we want to support retail, typically developers like a little bit of traffic. So it's unlikely that you're going to get 15 metres, because we would look up our standards and see the integrated B for town centre is 25.2 metres. Now, that's not that big a deal, but let's just have a look at what that does. There's 22.5, and we probably stick a medium down. It's not the best Photoshop job, but you're getting the impression of how it's all coming together. So we widen that out. And then, of course, the nail in the coffin would be the modernist, or you know, I don't even know if it's got a movement anymore. It's just the architecture that we get today. So it's no surprise that we're getting these places that we have because of these standards. So the point is, it's very difficult to go and deliver Fremantle again. Not because we don't know how to deliver, you know, traditional architecture, or there's some arguments to say that colonial architecture is oppressive or whatever it is. The main reason is that the standards for the roads that we use and the adherence to traffic projections and whatnot will always blow out urban environments unless there's some common sense brought to the table. So in thinking about this, and the reason that I like to pull together these kind of graphics to show people is because I think typically you've got government pointing at private developers saying, you need to do better. And we've got private developers pointing at government saying, you know, you need to change your standards. And I don't think there's the proper discussion about what both can do together. And Paul Keating was getting at this. I don't think he's quite nailed it, but he's really he's probably the one person of our elected officials in a bygone era who we've seen get at it, with obviously his work at on the Better Cities Commission when he was in. But in 2010, he addressed the UDIA by saying, and a lot of this failure is not public policy, though of course some of it is, it arises more often than not from an absence of civic conscientiousness on the part of developers and their architects, or if not, a kind of urban incoherence. So at least he's acknowledging that there's things to do on both sides of the coin. I think that's really important, because that's what we're forgetting with, I think, of the new urbanist movement and how much we could learn. Now, livable neighbourhoods in WA was based on was based on new urbanist principles. So I'm going to just finish with a little bit of a reflection on that. So thinking about Paul Keating's, I guess, some of his other things that he was saying, in structuring the perfect urban neighbourhood, you have this civic presence that's no longer at the heart of how we develop. But this is an example of an ideal street block, I guess you could say, in South Melbourne. 250 metres is about the max that you want to go to encourage walkability, and then if you can further break it down by that, those 125 metre increments, you'll start to get some really good urban structuring and permeability. And you can do things like ensuring that prominent views always leading you to what is the most important thing in that particular neighbourhood. And there might be uniformity between the architecture of the neighbourhood itself, but I guess the more civic structures can have a bit more of a free rein to stand out. And smaller green spaces, which you typically see in older cherished suburbs, are actually a lot harder to deliver nowadays, because we get a lot of resistance from local governments who say that they're stretched with funding and they'd much rather consolidate those green spaces into larger spaces without thinking about, I guess, the spatial implications and what the experience of those spaces is like. It is intimidating for a toddler to be in an open space without any definition or a sense of safety. And we can't have active playing grounds just as every single bit of open space. So this is the missing piece. It really is. We've seen some private developments in WA make reference to this, but no one's really given it a fair crack. It's the urban to rural transect. Obviously, it's come out of the best US new urbanist communities. And obviously, Jindee, I have to acknowledge, is probably the first one in Australia that's doing it properly, with adherence to standards that respond to context. And that's really important, because generally the only piece that we think about is density. But there's so much more to that. There's the way that your street, the curb radii, for instance, might be really tight, and you accept that you are going to have slow-moving traffic in a more of an urban environment. But the big sweeps can happen out in the outer suburbs and sort of peri-rural areas. And then it's the way that your landscaping team responds. It might be a bit more informal in suburban settings, but it formalizes and street trees become at a regular interval, and they're exotics perhaps in urban environments, and they're natives out in their suburban environments. And this is not the way to structure a city. This is the way to structure a neighborhood, because of course it's the idea that everyone in a suburban environment has the right and privilege to walk down to downtown, and likewise anyone who's living in a smaller place because they want to be near their action has the privilege of having access by foot or cycle to more naturalistic areas. When you think about how we do development, typically across Australia, it's a lot of that T3 suburban area without too much else. So form-based codes are the way to start addressing this stuff. And when we think about form-based codes, it's not just extinguishing current planning controls. You need to get in there, as I've hinted at the start of this presentation, and you need to unpick all those other things that are working against you and put in codes like Jindy has done for thoroughfares, for landscape, and for the private realm itself. And that's the only way that you'll deliver a a really true new urbanist, new community. They also do away, this is a discussion we're just not having here, and we should, they do away with functional road classification. This idea that there's integrators, distributors, local roads based on traffic volumes, and there's a centralized road agency that controls and dictates your future based on where you are on that hierarchy. New urbanists talk about much more urban responsive thoroughfare types. So use terms like boulevards and avenues and streets and roads. And of course, the difference between a boulevard and an avenue is not necessarily their width and behaviour, but an avenue is linking to important places, and it's obviously has a clear line of sight to perhaps something that's anchored by a civic presence or a retail presence and something on the other side, whereas a boulevard is actually sort of never ending and has that sort of illusion that it's not necessarily terminated by anything in particular. So when I made that discovery, I sort of realized that New York, those first, second, third, fourth avenues, they're actually technically boulevards, as a little fun fact. Now, can you imagine just trying to do this here with all the things that that I hinted at earlier? And there's other things in terms of drainage requirements and all kinds of things that are working against us. But as I said, Jindy's making an attempt to do that and we haven't yet seen how the more urban stuff is going to go towards the coast, but they'll get there. And just thinking about some of the other, just a reflection on the US market in particular, because some people make reference to it and wonder why it's not happening here in Australia. Well, US is a lot bigger. Obviously, they've got 300 million people, we've got 25. So even if there's the same percentage of people that want this stuff, there's obviously a lot more. And there is the design talent there, but there's also a market for it, right? So
hello, people. Are you?
So some of the things that just thinking about here, we've got civic presence. This is designed by Dole and Partners. Them and DPZ are some that you should follow in the US just to get some really good ideas. These kind of ideas of just opening out to the ocean or a river. We've got important vistas terminated by civic presence or what appears to be a sort of an avenue treatment, which might be a post office or something, but just the subtlety of just twisting some of these buildings as well to create interesting spaces. These are some of the design sort of cues that we'd like to sort of see in some of the designs here. Now we can do that, and we do have designers who have the talent to do that here, but it's creating the market for it. That's the tricky part. And then the financing that sits behind that is a whole other thing, which I'll get to in a minute. So the other pleasing development that we ought to, as a group, I think we ought to be throwing our weight behind is what's happening in Tasmania. You can see the Carr family has hired DPZ and progressing or trying to progress with the Skylands Tasmania Peninsula. And I know it's got all kinds of controversy with environmental concerns and whatnot, but again, just this idea of this level of talent here in Australia, with really fine-grained, intricate urban block structures that are really responsive to the topography, and you can just tell that they've gone and studied Battery Point over the drink there, and they've really studied these 400-metre increments of walkability, and the roads are responding to topography, and we've got some really interesting forms going up. But importantly, they've managed to keep a lot of their blocks at a regular sort of shape so that project builders can still respond to a certain form-based code without incurring too many costs. So that'll be one to watch. In terms of financing, I don't think I've got time to go into the detail, but just one thing I think that's worth sort of pointing out here is when people wonder why this stuff doesn't happen a lot here. Well, in 2008, I guess a lot of the private equity developers, Fiona Roche is one at Jindy, you'll see a lot less of them because a lot of them lost a lot of money. And typically since then, I would say we've just seen the rise of corporate developers, and nothing wrong with that. But understand that even if you can prove to them that long-term urbanism will always get a better return, because it does. There's 200 communities in the US that prove this. That's not necessarily what they're there for. They're there to get in and out. They've got to deploy capital, and the quicker they can get out that capital means they can move on to the next thing. And so long as it's predictable, urbanism is not predictable, right? I've just explained all these things that a developer would have to go and negotiate with the government on an incremental basis. There's so much uncertainty there, in addition to all the funding that's required to go and negotiate it with paying consultants. But it's the time of paying the interest on the land, it's the holding costs, and the blown out approval timeframes. Now, until you can address that, you will always get conventional suburbia, because we're going to get more and more corporates and even superannuation funds who will want a predictable return to report to their investors. So even if it's, as long as it's better than 7% per annum, because if it's not, they'll just put it in an ETF or something that's easier done in a in a low interest or an index fund online. But if we're in the space of development, 10-15%, if that's predictable per annum, great. Urbanism will do better long term, but it's just so unpredictable. So that's the main message for financing. There's other strategies around there. Just to finish, I know I've only left sort of a couple of minutes, 10 minutes maybe for questions, but I haven't talked much about architecture, but there's other people in this group who are much better at that stuff than me. So I decided to focus on, I guess, what I thought I could add in terms of where our focus is. But this is our attempt in the place that I'm at now in giving back to the neighbourhood in designing to a vernacular. We're in East Vic Park. It's a very small block, 270 square metres, and it's more. I just more wanted to show that although I did a lot of reading in terms of trying to find out proportions and golden ratios, and looked up the width and length of rooms to figure out ceiling heights and things like that based on traditional proportions. But really lucky that I had family, Poppy Bob, who's incredibly skilled, who made those barn doors for us, which just look absolutely fantastic. And then it is a battle axe lot, so I did just want to have this arrival experience of this playing on the East Vic Park sort of weatherboard look. For our over east guys, you guys build with timber. Only 20% of our homes are built with timber here. 80% is built by bricks. This is a timber framed home, but it's got some big, thick internal walls to get the thermal mass. And we've designed it to get the 32-degree sun angle in at winter, and it warms up without any air conditioning, so it's working really well. Sliding doors are the antithesis to traditional urbanism, but at least you can't see that from the street. And I have gone with the French doors around around Tani's little art studio there. So this is it's a work in progress, but you can see it's a very small block, but we do have space for trees and a bit of a backyard as well. So anyway, just some ideas to get you flowing. So sorry, Millie, I probably spoke for a bit too long there.
No, I love that, because I love how much you can do with a small block. And you always hear in Australia, we want a big block, but in reality, there's so much possibility. But I mean, I just thought that was so fascinating, and I was actually on tenterhooks waiting for the urban one. So I thought it was brilliant. Because it just shows you that the simplest little thing that you'd expect as a pedestrian or a layperson, and the things we admire and love so much about older or traditional places are just so hard to do, or at least they're tipped over by the tiniest little thing. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. So I think that this is a real gift. And another thing I thought was really interesting is you kept mentioning conflict. You know, there's a conflict, and of course we can see who's usually winning out in those conflicts, right? And that's because of pure development economics, and I think a huge emphasis culturally on efficiency and you know, utilitarian principles. But I think a lot of people really care about this, and it can be really disempowering to not be a planning professional and to kind of feel a little bit overwhelmed when you hear about some of this regulatory stuff, because I know I do, right? So I think it's really important to have that big strategic vision and actually tap into what people care about and tap into people's desire for beauty. But we also need the language behind it and the specificity, and we need to be able to say what's going wrong. And so that's kind of, I think, the value that something like this provides, because, you know, engineers have standards that they can fall back on, right? Whereas, you know, sometimes you feel a little bit like a lone person in the crowd calling out for beauty when everything else is just so mathematical. And I love that we've brought in, you know, the idea of the transect and how valuable that could be. But, you know, I'd really encourage anybody who wants to reach out to Eric after this presentation, because he's a real wealth of data. And Eric, I'd love if you could post the source for that economics data as well. I'd love to be able to bring that into our research a bit. But if anybody here has a question, I might just open up now to questions and just see if anybody wanted to ask Eric anything about his presentation. Just jump in. And don't be shy, because I know somebody's got a question and they're being polite and waiting for somebody else. So, I mean, I can definitely offer one up myself, Eric. I think, you know, you've brought in the transect, but to me, what I really am thinking about now is just how far we have to go. And I'd be really curious to know that if you were made the planning minister tomorrow, let's just say that the main roads portfolio is under you as well, what would be like the top 3 things that you would change that you think would have the most impact to planning policy?
I've always been pushing for, not on mute, yeah, I've always been pushing for an engineering street design manual. It's what we're missing here in WA. Auckland put one in a couple of years ago, and they did a really good job of making sure that their planning regime was talking to the engineering regime. They have a very clear line of sight with their document suite. We don't have that, so we've had livable neighbourhoods since 1996. And there was a brief period up until 2002, 2003, where we had a supporting street design manual that would make some improvements. We would make some improvements on in the modern day, but nonetheless, that was there, and then it just was sort of forgotten about when it became became a proper operational policy in the early 2000s. But it still wasn't quite enough, you see, because engineers keep referring to OS roads, which is originally a highway design code that's been extrapolated over time to include lower order streets. But of course, in part 1 of the document suite, it says if there are local street design standards, you're best using them, because this is not for local streets. It's really clear in there. But we keep getting the references to it, and that's because there's an absence of proper street design engineering guidance here in WA. So Queensland went through the process a couple of years ago. They did theirs, yeah, I know Auckland's a good one.
New South Wales does, I think, yeah.
Yeah, and ACT just literally this week released some good walking and cycling standards as well.
Yeah.
But individual standards are not the way to go either. And I feel a bit for it's probably people who are tuning in and think, what are you talking about? Because that's their wheelhouse. You know, if they're transport professionals, they're going to release a walking and cycling document, but it all happens at the space of urbanism. And that's why livable neighbourhoods is so good, because it is controlling the whole structure of everything: roads, streets, drainage, parks. It's the arrangement of everything, and it needs to be held up as the document that everything is falling into order with. So it's about, you know, if I were minister, I would unpick everything that was in contradiction to livable neighbourhoods, and I just put in standards that that supported it.
I mean, it's quite clear to me that you can't just have a code. There needs to be some broader vision. It needs to, you know, there's a big difference between implementing or ignoring a code, as the case may be, and yeah, without that you do get better results, but I'm not quite sure that they would be as ambitious as I would. So Alvin has a question. If I visit almost any town from a few hundred years ago, in climates like Perth, I'd see narrow streets and 2 to 3 story buildings to create shade. What's your thoughts on this, Eric?
Yeah, that's, I mean, there's plenty of reasons why it's not happening, and economically it's difficult. You know, you're not going to get 2 and 3 story developments out in our newer suburbs because you know, the minimum cost that we can get these things down to is to build nowadays is $400,000, and you know, it costs the same amount to buy an apartment in Northbridge than it does in, you know, Balladura. So of course you're just not going to get the apartment in Balladura. Our cost of our house was about $3,000 a square metre, and you can deliver single story in Perth for half that, $1,500 a square metre. So it's no surprise why we keep getting single story. So the development economics of it. And what was the other part of it? It's shade and climate.
Narrow streets.
Like you walk down Mexico and you see, I was in Oaxaca, and I noticed that footpaths are actually wider on there than the southern side of the streets, so they could you know, respond to the shade rather than have a uniform street design. So that, yeah, there's much more that can be done for climate sensitive design. But you know, I would say just going back to those you know, those original principles, like, you know, your was it, what's it, and what's the main street in Kalgoorlie? I've had a mind blank. But those and Fremantle, and anywhere where you had those traditional colonnades that were creating that shade on the main street. You know, I talked about how hard that is to deliver nowadays, because it is in the too hard basket, but it's not impossible. That's another little design cue we'd like to see a lot more of in newer main street environments. Yep,
colonnades, loges, all the good stuff. There's so much inspiration to take from older cities around the world. Beth is just asked, do you think changes to legislation for development economics or changes to codes and regulations has more sway in fixing these problems?
What's legislation got to do with development economics? I mean, it obviously influences it, but how can you pass legislation to
well, I mean, could you have something that either enforces or encourages stewardship, for example? So we know that is the big indicator of investment in the quality of the development. You know, the fact that you're you know, you have skin in the game, so to speak.
I think it's interesting because in the US, I know what happens is the new urbanists use their skill and their vision and their standards to tell the story and make promises of what they're going to deliver, because people are so upset with suburbia. And it's different over there because they're so afraid of government, of course, that they just haven't done the planning that we have done to the same level. So here in Perth, we have a metropolitan region scheme. Now, there's some US cities that have that, but by and large, that's fairly new. thinking about planning at the metropolitan scale. It was largely left to road agencies. But as a result, that actually created an opportunity for new urbanists, because to get a zoning permit, they would have to say, no, we're not the conventional suburbia guys. We're doing mixed use, and we're doing, we're doing traditional neighbourhood forms. Now, here, that would really amount to nothing, because it's like the MRS, Metropolitan Region Scheme, has already zoned it. So if it's coloured right on the plan, it's already zoned urban. You know what you're going to get. There's no games between the development industry and the government about promises like that, because that important part of the negotiations not happening. Now, occasionally you'll see it where there's pressures from communities where there's more contentious development, and the developer realises, oh, I've got to do something a little bit different here. But that's pretty rare when you're just rolling out suburban carpet.
Yeah, well, look, it's nearly at time, but Eric, thank you on behalf of everyone who joined today. And as you saw, we did record this call, so we'll make that available for anyone who wants it. But yeah, I encourage those who aren't to sign up to our email list, because we do this regularly. So we have these talks and they're good. But thank you for joining, and thank you again, Eric.
All right, thanks a lot.
Thanks,
Cheers.
Eric.
Have a good one.
Yeah.
Bye.